The kitten was waving, not running. That was the thing Leo would never forget, not in 1,000 lifetimes. It wasn't scrambling in a blind panic, wasn't flattened in terror against the damp concrete divider. It was sitting up on its tiny haunches in the gravel and shattered glass of the highway shoulder, one impossibly small front paw raised and batting at the air, a deliberate, desperate little wave at the hurricane of cars that blew past it, a 70-mile-an-hour blur of indifference. Each semi-truck that roared by sucked the air out of the world, rocking the kitten on its feet. But it just steadied itself and waved again. A signal, a plea. See me. See me. Stop. Leo saw it because he was stopped. His piece of crap sedan had finally given up the ghost, its engine giving one last shuddering sigh of steam 2 exits from anywhere that mattered. He was parked on the narrow shoulder, hazard lights clicking a frantic, useless rhythm against the indifferent roar of the evening commute. His head was in his hands, the heel of his palm pressing into his right eye, trying to push back the throbbing pressure of a day that had started bad and was now curdling into a genuine disaster. The rain had started, a fine, cold mist that wasn't quite rain and wasn't quite fog, just a wet misery that seeped through his thin jacket. He could smell the acid tang of overheated radiator fluid, the exhaust fumes from the traffic, the wet asphalt. It was the smell of failure. It was the smell of his life lately. He'd been sitting there for 20 minutes, phone dead, no AAA, watching the world scream past him. Everyone had someplace to be. He didn't. That's when he saw the movement, in his side mirror. A flicker of gray and white in the dying light. At first he thought it was a plastic bag, caught in the vortex of a passing car. But it didn't blow away. It held its ground. He squinted, his breath fogging the cold glass of the window. And then he saw the paw. A tiny white mittened paw, lifting, patting the air as a red pickup truck barreled past. So close the kitten was swallowed in the spray from its tires. His heart didn't just sink. It plummeted. It left a hollow, aching cavity in his chest. Because he knew that wave. He knew that feeling of being utterly, completely inconsequential. Of screaming into a void that didn't even bother to echo your voice back. It was the same feeling he'd had sitting across from his boss that afternoon, being told his position was being phased out. The same feeling he'd had watching his girlfriend's taillights disappear down their street for the last time a month ago. The same feeling he had every night in his too-quiet apartment where the only sound was the hum of the refrigerator and the weight of his own disappointment. You put your hand up. You signal. And nobody stops. He was out of the car before the thought had even fully formed in his mind. The sound was a physical assault, a deafening, relentless roar that vibrated in his teeth. The wind from the cars whipped the mist into his face, stinging his eyes. He edged along the side of his car, his body pressed against the cold, wet metal. The kitten was maybe 50 feet back, 50 feet of sheer suicidal exposure. "Hey," he yelled, his voice a pathetic, shredded thing against the traffic's din. "Hey, little guy." The kitten didn't look at him. Its entire universe was the cars. Its whole being was focused on that one futile task. Wave. They will see. They will stop. A blue minivan sped by, and the kitten flinched, its whole tiny body shuddering, but the paw went up again. It was the most heartbreaking thing Leo had ever seen. This wasn't just fear. This was hope. A stubborn, terrifying, and utterly devastating hope. He had to get to it. He took a step into the gravel, and the slipstream of a passing FedEx truck nearly knocked him off his feet. It was insane. This was how people died. They became statistics on the nightly news. Man and kitten killed in highway incident. A stupid, pointless end to a stupid, pointless day. He looked back at the kitten. It was so small. It couldn't have been more than a few weeks old. Its gray fur was plastered to its body by the mist, making it look even more fragile, like a tiny drowned rat. But its eyes, he could see them now, even from this distance. Huge and round and a startling electric blue in the gloom. They were fixed on the oncoming headlights, wide with a terror that was slowly being replaced by a dawning, exhausted confusion. The wave was getting weaker, slower. It was giving up. That decided it. The hollow ache in his chest was suddenly filled with a cold, sharp purpose. He wasn't going to watch this tiny creature learn the same lesson he had. Not today. He waited for a tiny gap in the traffic, a breath in the relentless onslaught. His own heart was hammering against his ribs, a frantic drumbeat against the symphony of engines. He took a deep breath, the air tasting of diesel and panic, and he ran. It wasn't a graceful run. It was a stumbling, slipping scramble over loose gravel and spilled oil. His shoes skidded, and he threw out a hand, scraping his palm raw on the concrete barrier. He didn't stop. He lunged the last few feet, his body curving over the spot where the kitten sat, a human shield against the world. He was so close now. He could hear it. Not a meow, but a tiny, rasping little sound, a broken squeak of exhaustion. E. E. The smell of wet fur and fear was sharp in his nose. He slowly, so slowly, lowered himself into a crouch, making himself small, trying not to be a giant looming monster. "Hey," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "It's okay, I see you, I stopped." The kitten finally turned its head. Those huge blue eyes locked onto his. There was no trust in them, only a bottomless, weary shock. It was shivering violently, a constant, tiny tremor that ran through its entire body. The little white paw, still raised, slowly lowered to the ground. Its job was done. Very slowly, Leo shrugged out of his jacket. The wind immediately bit through his flannel shirt, raising goosebumps on his arms. He didn't. "Curdy." He held the jacket out in front of him, a makeshift net, a offering. "Come on, little buddy," he murmured, his voice a low, steady hum he hoped was calming. "Let's get out of the rain." The kitten just stared. It was too tired to run, too defeated to even be afraid of him anymore. It was a small, soggy monument to exhaustion. Leo moved with an excruciating slowness, every muscle tense. He could feel the whoosh of a car passing behind him, the jacket flapping in the wind. He didn't look. His whole world had shrunk to this 3-foot circle of grimy asphalt and this one, tiny, trembling life. He draped the jacket over the kitten in one smooth, gentle motion. There was a moment of resistance, a tiny, muffled squeak of protest, and then stillness. He carefully bundled the jacket up, making a soft, dark nest with the small, light weight at its center. He could feel the frantic, bird-like beat of its heart through the fabric. Ba-bump, 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 so fast, so alive. He cradled the bundle against his chest, shielding it with his body, and turned back toward his dead car. The walk back felt longer, the traffic louder, more menacing. Every gust of wind from a passing vehicle felt like a direct threat. He fumbled with the passenger door handle, his wet, scraped fingers slipping, and finally yanked it open. He half fell into the driver's seat, pulling the door shut behind him. Silence. Well, not true silence. The traffic was still a dull, thunderous roar outside the glass. The rain still pattered a gentle tattoo on the roof. But inside the car it was a different world. A world containing only his ragged breathing and the soft, rustling bundle on the passenger seat. He sat there for a full minute, just staring straight ahead, his hands gripping the steering wheel, trying to get his own heart to slow down. Adrenaline was coursing through him, making his fingers tremble. He had just risked his life for a stray kitten. What was he thinking? What was he going to do with it? He slowly, carefully, unfolded the edges of his jacket. 2 enormous blue eyes peered out from the dark fabric. The kitten was still shivering, a little convulsive shake that seemed to start at its nose and travel all the way to the tip of its tail. It was curled into the smallest, tightest ball possible, trying to preserve any shred of warmth. It didn't make a sound. It just watched him. Leo reached out, his movements slow and deliberate, and gently stroked the top of its head with one finger. The fur was cold and wet, matted with dirt. The kitten flinched at the touch but didn't pull away. It just closed its eyes, a long, slow blink of utter weariness. And in that quiet, broken-down car on the side of a rain-swept highway with the world screaming past them, something began. It wasn't a grand thing. It was a tiny, fragile, almost invisible thread spun from a single act of stopping and a single desperate wave. Leo knew with a certainty that settled deep in his bones that nothing was going to be the same. The car was dead. His phone was dead. But this small, wet creature on his passenger seat was vibrantly, terrifyingly alive. And it was now his. He had no idea what the little thing had been through, what had led it to that desperate patch of gravel. He didn't know its story, just like nobody knew his. But he had seen its signal, and he had stopped. And for the first time in a very, very long time, Leo felt the quiet, unmistakable weight of a beginning. The first night was a long, quiet vigil held in the dim glow of a single lamp. Leo's apartment had never felt so loud in its silence. The hum of the refrigerator was a monstrous thing. The soft tick-tick-tick of the baseboard heater was a countdown to something he couldn't name. He'd placed the bundled jacket, kitten and all, in the center of his bathroom floor, the smallest, easiest to clean room he had. He'd set down a saucer of water and another of tuna fish he'd drained from a can, the smell sharp and briny in the small tiled space. Then he'd turned off the bright overhead light, clicked on the small lamp in the living room, and sat on the cold hardwood floor just outside the bathroom door, his back against the wall. He left the door open just a crack. An invitation. Not an intrusion. He could hear it in there. The tiniest of sounds. A soft, shuffling movement. The faintest lap, lap, lap at the water dish. Then, nothing. Just the shallow, rapid breathing of a creature too scared to even breathe properly. He didn't peek. He just sat there in the half-light, his knees pulled up to his chest, and listened. His own heart was still slowing from the adrenaline of the highway. His scraped palm throbbed. He looked around his apartment, seeing it through the lens of this new fragile presence. It was a place of functional sadness. A couch for one, a single plate and mug in the drying rack, a stack of unopened mail on the counter, probably more. Bad news. It was the home of someone who had stopped expecting visitors. Someone who had stopped expecting much of anything. He must have dozed off, because he jerked awake to a sound, not from the bathroom, from the living room window. A soft, insistent tapping. The rain had turned heavier, pelting the glass. The world outside was a blur of wet darkness. The clock on the microwave glowed 3:17 a.m., and then he heard the other sound. From the bathroom, a tiny, broken purr. It wasn't the deep, contented rumble of a happy cat. It was a ragged, stuttering vibration, like a tiny engine that couldn't quite turn over, hiccuping with fear and exhaustion. It was a sound of pure, involuntary comfort-seeking, a biological response to being warm for the first time in what was likely its entire short life. It was the most lonely sound Leo had ever heard. He didn't move. He just closed his eyes and listened to it. A strange and fragile duet with the rain against the glass. This tiny creature, warm and full for a moment, was trying to comfort itself in the dark of a strange room. He knew that feeling. The number of times he'd lain in his own bed, wrapping his arms around himself, trying to simulate the comfort of another person, trying to jumpstart his own stalled-out heart. It's okay, you're okay, he'd whisper to the empty room, a hollow mantra. This kitten's purr was the physical version of that. A body's desperate, hopeful lie to a terrified mind. The purr eventually sputtered out, replaced by the soft, even breaths of sleep. Leo finally slept too, his head against the wall, his dreams filled with the sound of waves and the smell of wet asphalt. Morning came, gray and weak through the rain-streaked windows. Leo's neck was stiff, his back a symphony of aches from the hard floor. The bathroom door was still cracked open. He pushed it slowly with his fingertips. The kitten was gone. A jolt of pure panic shot through him. Had it slipped out in the night? He'd been right there. He scrambled to his feet, his heart hammering, and threw the door open. The tuna was gone. The water dish was half empty. And then he saw it. A tiny gray ear, twitching, just visible behind. The toilet bowl. It had crammed itself into the impossibly narrow space between the porcelain and the wall, a sliver of shadow in a shadow. It was trying to become part of the architecture. It was hiding in plain sight. Leo let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. It was still here, it was just terrified. He refilled the water dish, opened a new can of tuna, and retreated, leaving the door wide open this time. He went about his morning routine on autopilot, making coffee, the rich, bitter smell filling the apartment. He kept his movements slow, his sounds minimal. He didn't look toward the bathroom. He just let his presence be a fact of the environment, not a threat. This became their rhythm. Their unspoken, careful dance. Days turned into a week. The kitten was a ghost in his apartment. Leo would catch glimpses of it, a blur of gray disappearing under the couch, the tip of a tail vanishing around a doorframe. It was always watching, though. He could feel its eyes on him. From the dark space under the armchair, from the gap in the bedroom closet door he'd left ajar. It was studying him, learning the map of his solitude. He learned its patterns, its language. It was most active in the deep silence of the night. Leo started waking up at 2 or 3 a.m., drawn out of sleep by some new instinct. He'd pad quietly into the living room and find evidence of a nocturnal life lived in the margins. The little felt mouse he'd bought, dragged from its spot in the middle of the floor to under the radiator. A few pieces of dry food carefully fished out of the bowl and left on the welcome mat by the door, like tiny, strange offerings. It was exploring. It was claiming territory 1 inch at a time. He started talking to it, not in a baby voice, not trying to coax it out. Just a low, steady monologue about nothing in particular. He'd talk about the rain, about the plot of a movie he'd half-watched, about the weird dream he'd had. He'd read articles on his phone out loud, his voice a calm, neutral hum in the quiet apartment. He was giving it a soundtrack to his presence. A voice that didn't yell, didn't threaten, didn't demand anything. A voice that just was. And he watched its behaviors, each one a tiny, breathtaking revelation. The way it would freeze, one paw in the air if he shifted too suddenly in his chair. The slow, deliberate blinks it would give him from across the room when it thought he wasn't looking. A cat's version of a tentative smile. The way its ears would swivel like tiny radar dishes, tracking his movement from another room, listening to the cadence of his breathing. It was learning him just as he was learning it. One afternoon, about 10 days in, something shifted. Leo was sitting on the floor, his back against the couch, scrolling through job listings on his laptop, the familiar knot of anxiety tightening in his stomach. The rejection emails were piling up. Each one felt like a small death. He was so lost in the spiral of his own failure that he didn't notice the quiet approach. A movement in his peripheral vision made him freeze. The kitten was there. It had come out from its hiding place in broad daylight. It was sitting about 5 feet away, just watching him. Its head was tilted, those blue eyes fixed on his face. It wasn't hiding. It was observing. Leo didn't move a muscle. He didn't even dare to breathe. He just watched it back, his heart doing a slow, heavy roll in his chest. The kitten took a step forward, then another. Its movements were painfully cautious, its body low to the ground. It stopped just out of arm's reach. It was close enough that Leo could see the individual white whiskers against its gray fur, the little patch of white on its chest that rose and fell with its quick breaths. It could smell the tuna on his fingers from lunch. It could probably smell his sweat, his anxiety. It looked from his face to the laptop screen, then back to his face. It let out a small, quiet mrrp. A question. And then it did something that stole the air from Leo's lungs. It very slowly, very deliberately lowered itself onto the rug, curled its tail around its feet, and just stayed. It didn't touch him. It didn't come closer. It simply chose to be in the same room as him openly, without the shield of darkness or furniture. It was keeping him company. Have you ever had an animal wait for you, even when you didn't ask? Them too? Not for food, not for a door to be opened. Just wait. Just share the space of your sadness with you, without demanding you explain it. It's a quiet kind of magic. It's a language that exists below words. It says, I see your weight. I will sit here with it for a while. Leo felt a pressure behind his eyes, a hot, surprising sting of tears. He looked down at the kitten, this tiny refugee from the hurricane of the highway, and felt a connection so profound it was dizzying. This creature, who had every reason to fear the world, had chosen to trust his quiet. It had chosen his particular brand of sadness over the terror of the unknown. He slowly, so slowly it felt like moving through syrup, extended his index finger. He didn't reach for it. He just laid his hand on the rug, his finger pointing toward it, and offering a bridge. The kitten watched the hand. Its ears twitched. Its nose wiggled, sniffing the air. It looked at his face, then back at the hand. The silence in the room was absolute, a held breath. A minute passed, another. Then it uncurled. It leaned forward, ever so slightly, and stretched its own neck out. It didn't move its body. It just extended the very tip of its existence toward him. Its tiny pink nose, cold and wet, touched the very tip of his finger. The contact lasted less than a second. A spark of cold, a whisper of touch. The kitten immediately pulled back, its eyes wide, as if shocked by its own bravery. It didn't run. It just settled back onto its haunches, watching him, its body thrumming with the aftershock of the contact. Leo left his hand on the rug, his finger still tingling from the touch. He looked at the kitten, and for the first time, he didn't see a pitiful creature he'd saved. He saw a companion, a small, fierce, independent spirit who had assessed him and found him acceptable, maybe even safe. The kitten gave him one long, slow blink, a gesture of trust he now understood. Leo, his throat too tight to speak, blinked back. The bond wasn't sealed with a dramatic gesture. It was sealed in that perfect, silent moment. A tiny, cold nose on a warm finger, a blink in the gray afternoon light. A shared understanding between two creatures who had both, in their own ways, been waving from the side of the road for a very, very long time, and had finally been seen. The trust, once given, became a new kind of language between them. Leo named her Wave. It was the only thing that felt right. It wasn't a cutesy name. It was a fact. It was her history, her first act of communication with the world. A signal in the storm. She started to respond to it, her ears pricking up at the soft W sound, her head tilting in that curious way she had. Their lives settled into a delicate, peaceful rhythm. Mornings were for the slow blink of sunlight through the blinds, for the sound of dry food hitting the ceramic bowl, for Wave emerging from her favorite hiding spot, the warm, dark space behind the books on the bottom shelf of the bookcase. Evenings were for Leo on the couch, his laptop glowing, and Wave eventually, tentatively, leaping up to curl herself into a tight, warm donut on the far cushion, just within the periphery of his vision. She never initiated contact, but she accepted it now. She would permit a single finger to stroke the incredibly soft fur between her ears, and her broken purr would kick in, that stuttering, hesitant engine that sounded like it was still surprised to be running at all. But then, the pattern started, the shift. It began subtly, about 3 weeks after her arrival. Leo came home from a frustrating trip to the grocery store, the kind of mundane errand that now felt like a monumental effort. He'd gotten so used to the quiet of the apartment, to the company of his own thoughts and the silent, watching presence of the cat, that the bright lights and noise of the store were a physical assault. He unlocked his door, shouldered it open, and went through the new ritual he'd developed. A soft, "Hey, Wave, I'm home." Usually he'd see a pair of eyes glow from some corner, or hear the soft thump as she jumped down from a windowsill to come investigate the grocery bags. This time there was nothing. The apartment was still. Not a scared stillness, but an empty one. He felt it immediately, a cold little knot forming in his gut. He checked all her spots, behind the books, under the couch. In the bathroom cabinet he'd left slightly ajar for her. Nothing. Panic, cold and sharp, lanced through him. A window. Had he left a window open? He raced through the small apartment, checking every latch. They were all locked tight. The door had been locked. It was impossible. She was just hiding, he told himself, She's gotten better at it. She's finally found the perfect spot. He tried to go about putting the groceries away, his movements jerky, his ears straining for any sound. The silence was deafening. An hour passed. Then 2. The sun began to set, painting the living room in long orange shadows. The knot in his stomach was a hard, cold stone. He'd lost her. He'd failed her. The one good thing he'd managed to do, and he'd somehow screwed it up. The old familiar script of his own inadequacy started playing in his head, a cruel, well-worn monologue. And then, just as the last of the light was fading from the sky, he heard it. A faint, almost imperceptible scratching sound. Not at the door. It was coming from the wall. From the narrow hallway that led to his bedroom and the single, tiny linen closet. He stood up, his heart in his throat, and walked slowly toward the sound. It was coming from inside the closet. He pulled the door open. It was pitch black inside, smelling of clean towels and dust. The scratching stopped. He reached in and fumbled for the pull string for the light bulb. The weak yellow light illuminated stacks of towels, old board games, a vacuum cleaner. And there, in the very back corner, tucked behind a pile of old blankets, was Wave. She was covered in a fine gray dust, and she was frantically trying to burrow into the wall itself, her little claws scraping against the baseboard. "Wave," he whispered, his voice ragged with relief and confusion. She stopped scratching and turned to look at him. Her eyes were wide, but not with fear. They were bright, intense, almost urgent. She let out a short, sharp meow, a sound he'd never heard from her before. It wasn't a cry for food or a sound of distress. It was an announcement. "I am here. I have returned." She trotted out of the closet, brushed past his leg without her usual hesitation, and headed straight for her food bowl, leaving a trail of dust on the floor behind her. Leo was left staring at the back of the closet, his mind racing. How had she gotten in there? The door had been closed, he was sure of it. He got down on his hands and knees, pushing the pile of blankets aside, and that's when he saw it. At the very bottom of the wall where the baseboard met the floor was a small, jagged hole. It was hidden perfectly by the pile of linens. It was just big enough for a very small cat to squeeze through. A draft, cold and smelling of old, dry wood, whispered from the darkness within. She had a secret passage. She was coming and going. The discovery should have been a relief. She wasn't lost, she wasn't trapped. But the cold knot in his stomach only tightened into something else. Dread. Where did it lead? Into the walls? Into another apartment? Out into the building itself? The thought of her navigating the dark, dangerous innards of the old building, of maybe finding her way back outside near the busy streets, it made him feel sick. The pattern was established after that. She would vanish. Sometimes for an hour, sometimes for almost a whole afternoon. She always came back dusty, sometimes with cobwebs clinging to her whiskers. And she always came back different. Not scared, but preoccupied. Distant. She'd eat with a frantic energy, then often retreat to a high perch on top of the bookcase and stare into the middle distance, her tail twitching slightly at the tip, as if replaying some important mission in her mind. Leo started trying to figure out her schedule, her tells. He noticed she'd usually get a certain look about her, a focused, determined set to her ears, right before she'd disappear. She'd stop whatever she was doing, perk up as if hearing a frequency he couldn't detect, and then slink purposefully toward the hallway closet. He'd try to follow, to gently discourage her, to block the hole, but the second he tried to intervene, she'd abandon the mission entirely, giving him a look that seemed almost disappointed. She'd then spend the rest of the day watching him with a quiet, unnerving intensity, as if waiting for him to understand something he was too stupid to grasp. He tried to figure out what was on the other side of that wall. His apartment was on the end of the building. The other side of that wall shouldn't be another apartment. It should be the building's crawl space, or a narrow gap between buildings. Was there a nest of something in there? Was she hunting? But she never brought back prey. She brought back something else. It started small. A few days after he discovered the hole, he found a twisted piece of copper wire, thick and old, left neatly in the center of his pillow. Another time it was a smooth white river stone, cold to the touch, placed carefully next to her food bowl. They weren't gifts offered to him. They were trophies, brought back from her expeditions and deposited in the heart of their shared territory. They were artifacts, proof of a world he couldn't see. The mystery of it consumed him. His job search, his own loneliness, the vast, overwhelming problems of his life, all shrank next to the urgent, pressing need to know. What was his cat doing? In the walls? His worry was a constant low-grade hum in the back of his mind. He'd be reading a book and his eyes would unfocus, seeing not the words but that dark, dusty hole. He'd be trying to sleep, and he'd imagine he heard the faint, skittering sound of her movement inside the walls, a ghost in the machine of his home. Do you think animals know when we're at our lowest? Maybe they do. Or maybe they just have their own profound priorities, their own secret histories that we only ever see the edges of. Wave's secret life wasn't about him. He knew that. It was something she needed to do, a compulsion, a memory she was obeying. But her absences left a hole in the apartment, and in him, that he hadn't realized she'd been filling. The quiet felt deeper, more hollow when she was gone. The worry was a physical ache. The breaking point came on a Tuesday. It had been a bad day. Another rejection email, this one from a job he'd actually let himself feel hopeful about. The apartment felt like it was closing in on him. Wave had been gone for over 3 hours, her longest absence yet. The sky outside had darkened into a thunderous bruised purple. A storm was rolling in. He could feel the pressure drop, the air growing thick and heavy. He paced the living room, his anxiety spiking with every low rumble of thunder in the distance. The thought of her trapped in some dark, confined space during a storm terrified him. He couldn't stand it. He marched to the hallway closet, pulled the door open, and shoved the pile of blankets aside. He got down on his stomach, his cheek pressed against the cold floor, and shone the flashlight from his phone into the hole. The beam of light cut through, the absolute blackness, illuminating a narrow, terrifying space. It was a crawl space just as he'd suspected, a forgotten cavity between walls filled with decades of dust, ancient sawdust, and tangles of outdated wiring. The air that poured out was dank and carried the faint metallic smell of old pipes. He could see her footprints in the dust, a tiny, brave trail leading off into the impenetrable darkness. "Wave," he called into the void, his voice echoing, strangely in the cramped space. "Wave, come on, come back." Silence. Then a distant crack of thunder. The storm was almost here. He was about to call her name again to plead with the emptiness when the light from his phone caught something. Something that wasn't dust or wood or wire. It was a few feet into the crawl space, tucked against a joist. It was a small gathered pile of objects, a little hoard. He could make out a few more twisted wires, a couple of bottle caps, the river stone. But there, in the center of the pile, something glinted dully in the beam of his light. Something metallic and man-made, something that had no business being in the walls of his apartment. Before he could process it, he heard a frantic scrabbling from deep within the darkness. A moment later, Wave shot out of the hole like a gray cannonball, covered in more dust and cobwebs than he'd ever seen, her eyes wide with a primal fear of the coming storm. She didn't even look at him. She bolted past his head and disappeared into the living room, seeking shelter under the couch. Leo stayed on the floor, his heart hammering against the hardwood. The image was burned into his mind, the little nest, the gathered treasures, and that one object gleaming in the dark. He knew with a certainty that turned his blood cold that it wasn't just junk. It was a collection, a carefully curated one, and that glint of metal, it looked familiar. It looked like a locket, a tiny, tarnished, heart-shaped locket. He pulled back from the hole and sat up, the storm finally breaking outside, the rain, lashing against the windows. The sound of the world was a roar, but all he could hear was the frantic beating of his own heart. The mystery was no longer just about where she went. It was about what she was finding there, and what, or who, she might be remembering. The fragile piece of their life together shattered, replaced by a chilling, urgent need to know what was in the dark. He had to look. He had to see what she had found. The storm raged for an hour, a furious, pounding assault on the windows and roof. Leo sat on the floor of the hallway, his back against the wall opposite the closet, listening to the cacophony. Every crack of thunder felt like it was vibrating deep in his bones. Under the couch, he could hear the faint, frantic skittering of Wave's claws on the hardwood as she tried to burrow deeper, to disappear entirely. The sound was a physical pain in his chest. He wanted to reach for her, to pull her out and hold her, but he knew his touch would only be another layer of terror on top of the storm. So he just sat there, his own breath shallow, riding out the panic with her, separated by 10 feet of floor and a universe of fear. His mind wasn't on the storm, though. It was locked on that black hole in the wall, on the glint of tarnished metal. The image of it, a single stark point of light in that consuming darkness, was seared onto the back of his eyelids. It wasn't just curiosity anymore. It was a compulsion. A dread-filled, sickening need to know what was in that crawl space, what she had been bringing back, what memory or instinct was so powerful it pulled her back into the dark over and over again. The locket, it was the shape of it that got him. Heart-shaped. It was such a human thing, such a specific, sentimental object. It didn't belong in a world of dust and wires and forgotten construction. It belonged around a neck. It held a picture. It held a story. And Wave, this tiny feral creature of instinct and survival, had found it, had chosen it, had carried it in her mouth through that narrow, terrifying darkness to keep it in her little pile of treasures. Why? The storm finally began to subside, the thunder retreating to a low, grumbling complaint in the distance. The rain softened to a steady, rhythmic patter. The oppressive weight in the air lifted just a fraction. Under the couch, the skittering stopped. There was only the sound of her panicked breathing, slowly beginning to even out. Leo waited until he could only hear the rain. Then, moving like a man in a dream, he got to his feet. His body felt heavy, leaden. He went to the kitchen and found the heaviest flashlight he owned, a big, metal-cased thing that felt solid and real in his trembling hand. He clicked it on. The beam was a strong white-blue lance cutting through the dim apartment. He laid out a set of old clothes on the floor, a pair of jeans he used for painting, a thick, long-sleeved shirt he wouldn't mind ruining. He changed into them, the fabric feeling rough and final against his skin. This was insane. He was about to crawl into a hole in his wall. He had no idea what was in there. Spiders, rats, asbestos, rotting floorboards that could give way. The rational part of his brain was screaming at him to stop, to call a handyman, to just board the damn hole up and be done with it. But the rational part had left the building the moment he'd seen that locket. This was something else. This was a pull he felt in his gut, a deep, primal need to follow the trail his cat had laid for him, to see what she saw, to understand the map of her secret world. He took a deep breath, the air still electric with the storm's aftermath, and pulled open the closet door. The smell of old dust and damp wood wafted out, stronger now. He shoved the pile of blankets unceremoniously to the side. He got down on his hands and knees, then lowered himself onto his belly, the cold hardwood pressing against his chest. He shone the flashlight into the hole. The beam was infinitely better than his phone's light. It illuminated the crawl space in stark, dramatic relief. It was a landscape of nightmares. Thick, fuzzy cobwebs hung like ghostly curtains from the joists above. He could see the gnaw marks of rodents on ancient, brittle wires. The dust was a thick gray blanket over everything, undisturbed for decades except for one thing: a perfect, tiny set of paw prints leading bravely into the heart of the darkness. His heart was a wild drum against the floor. His palms were slick with sweat. He wiped them on his jeans, took another shaky breath, and began to army crawl into the hole. The transition was immediate and suffocating. The temperature dropped 10 degrees. The air was thick, clogging his nostrils and throat with the taste of decay and dry rot. The space was tighter than he'd imagined. The joists above were only about 18 inches from the floorboards below, forcing him to keep his head down, his spine curved. The flashlight beam bounced and juddered with his every movement, creating monstrous leaping shadows. Every brush against a cobweb sent a jolt of revulsion through him. He could hear the scuttling of unseen things in the darkness beyond his light. He followed her trail. The tiny, perfect prints were his guide, his Ariadne's thread in this labyrinth of forgotten things. He crawled past bundles of cloth-wrapped wires, past the skeletal remains of a long-dead mouse, past piles of ancient wood shavings. The further he went, the darker and tighter it felt. The walls of the building seemed to press in on him. His breathing became ragged, echoing too loudly in the cramped space. He was fighting a full-blown panic attack, his vision starting to tunnel. "What are you doing? What are you doing?" His mind shrieked, but he kept going. He had to. For her. After what felt like an eternity of crawling, the paw prints veered to the left, toward the outer wall of the building. The beam of his flashlight landed on it. And there it was. Her nest. It was a small, deliberate clearing in the dust, tucked into the corner where two massive wooden beams met. It was heartbreakingly neat. The objects were arranged not randomly, but with a strange sense of order. The twisted pieces of copper wire were lined up side by side like artifacts in a museum. The smooth river stones were stacked into a tiny pyramid. The bottle caps were arranged in a semicircle, and in the very center, placed with a reverence that made Leo's throat tighten, was the heart-shaped locket. It was old, the metal tarnished almost black, but the shape was unmistakable. He shuffled closer, the beam of the flashlight trembling in his hand. He reached out, his fingers shaking so badly he could barely control them. He picked up the locket. It was cold. He turned it over in his palm. There was a tiny, almost invisible seam around the edge. His thumbnail, grimy with dust, found the catch. He hesitated for a second, a superstitious fear gripping him. What was inside? A picture of a stranger? A lock of hair? Something that would make this even more inexplicable? More painfully sad? He pressed the catch. It was stiff, but it gave way with a tiny metallic click. The locket opened. Inside, on one side, was a photograph. It was tiny, faded with age and damp, the colors bleached to sepia tones. But the image was clear enough. It was a woman, smiling. She had kind eyes and dark hair swept back from her face. She looked young, happy. And nestled in the crook of her neck, peeking out from the collar of her sweater, was a tiny, fuzzy gray face with startling blue eyes. A kitten. A kitten that looked exactly like Wave. Leo's breath hitched. He felt the world tilt sideways. He wasn't in a crawl space anymore. He was in a tomb. A memorial. His eyes, blurring with tears he didn't realize had formed, moved to the other side of the locket. There was no picture there. Instead, tucked into the small metal frame was a single, impossibly soft white tuft of fur. A sob escaped him, a raw, broken sound that was swallowed by the dust and the dark. He understood. He finally understood. This wasn't a collection of junk. This was a shrine. This was memory. Wave hadn't been exploring. She had been returning. This was her home. Or it had been. This crawl space, it must have connected to another apartment. The apartment where she was born, where she had lived with this woman. Something had happened. The woman was gone. The apartment was empty or new people had moved in, and the only way back for Wave, the only connection to the love she had known, was through this dark, dangerous passage in the walls. She wasn't bringing back random objects. She was bringing back offerings, treasures to lay at the memory of the person she had lost. The wires, the stones, the bottle caps, they were the best things her tiny, grieving heart could find to say, "I remember you. I am still here. Are you still there?" The locket. The locket was the ultimate treasure. The heart of the heart. It smelled like her person. It contained her image. It contained her own baby fur. It was everything. Leo's body began to shake, uncontrollably. He curled into himself there in the filth and the darkness, the locket clutched in his dirty hand, and he wept. He wept for Wave's loss, a pain so profound this small animal had been trying to tunnel her way back to it through solid walls. He wept for the woman in the picture, who had loved a kitten and was now gone. He wept for his own loneliness, which suddenly felt small and shallow in the face of this pure, unwavering, feline grief. The tears cut tracks through the grime on his cheeks, falling silently onto the dust below. He didn't know how long he lay there, shattered by the understanding, but eventually a new sound pierced his grief. A soft, questioning meow. He lifted his head. There, at the entrance to the crawl space, backlit by the dim light from his apartment, was a small silhouette. Wave. She had come out from under the couch. She had come to find him. She took a few tentative steps into the crawl space, her nose twitching, her eyes reflecting the beam of the dropped flashlight. She saw him there, curled up in her secret place, surrounded by her treasures. She saw the open locket in his hand. She didn't hiss. She didn't run. She just walked, slowly, deliberately, toward him through the dust. She stopped when she reached him. She looked from his tear-streaked face to the locket in his hand and then back to his face. Her expression wasn't one of anger or violation. It was one of recognition. A deep, weary knowing. She took one more step forward. She lowered her head. And she did something she had never ever done before. She pressed the top of her head, her whole forehead firmly against his temple. It was a solid, warm, undeniable weight, a gesture of immense trust, a gesture of shared grief. It was a cat's version of pressing their face against yours, of saying, "I see your sorrow and you see mine. We are the same." A shuddering breath racked Leo's body. He slowly, so slowly, raised his trembling hand and laid it gently on her back. She didn't flinch. She leaned into the touch, her body vibrating with the sudden, strong, deep rumble of a purr that was no longer broken. It was whole. It was a purr of relief, of a burden finally shared. He finally saw what she had been trying to tell him all along. It wasn't a cry for help. It was an invitation. She hadn't been asking him to stop her. She had been waiting for him to follow, to understand that the hole in the wall wasn't an escape. It was a wound. And she had been waiting for someone to finally see it. The world didn't magically fix itself overnight. The next morning, the sun didn't shine any brighter. Leo's bank account wasn't suddenly full. The rejection emails from potential employers didn't transform into offers. The silence of his apartment was still there, a physical presence in the rooms. But the quality of the silence had changed. It was no longer an empty silence, a void that echoed with everything he'd lost. It was a shared silence, a comfortable breathing quiet, filled with the soft rhythm of another heart beating in sync with his own. The day after the crawl space, Leo did something he'd been putting off for weeks. He went to a hardware store. He bought a small, expandable panel of wire mesh, a staple gun, and a tube of sealant. The task was simple, physical. His hands, which had felt so useless and clumsy for months, had a purpose. He pulled everything out of the hallway closet, the towels and board games and vacuum cleaner, creating a small mountain in the living room. Wave sat on the arm of the couch, watching him with her intense blue eyes, her tail curled neatly around her feet. She didn't try to stop him. She didn't slink toward the hole with that determined look. She just watched. He got down on his knees, shone the flashlight into the dark space one last time. The little collection was still there, a museum of love in the dust. He didn't touch it. It wasn't his to disturb. He carefully fitted the wire mesh over the hole, stapling it securely into the wooden frame of the wall, sealing the edges with the thick white sealant. It wasn't a rejection. It wasn't him locking her out of her past. It was him building a door she no longer had to navigate alone in the terrifying dark. He was her door now. When he was finished, He put everything back in the closet, the smell of fresh sealant sharp in the air. He sat back on his heels and looked at Wave. She hopped down from the couch, walked over to the closed closet door, and sniffed along the bottom crack. She let out a small, thoughtful murmur, then turned and looked at him. She blinked slowly. Then she walked over and rubbed the entire length of her body against his kneeling leg. A full, confident, scent-marking gesture of ownership and belonging. This is mine. You are mine. The message was clear. That became their new normal. The desperate, lonely edge was gone from both of them, sanded down by the shared truth of that day in the dark. Mornings were no longer a grim exercise in forcing himself out of bed. They were greeted by a new ritual. Wave had taken to sleeping on the pillow, next to his head, her small body a warm, purring lump against his ear. He'd wake to the feeling of a single, rough-textured paw gently patting his cheek, her version of a polite alarm clock. The sun is up. I am here. It is time. He'd make coffee, and she'd follow him to the kitchen, not with the skittishness of a ghost, but with the confident trot of a partner. She'd wind figure eights around his ankles as he waited for the kettle to boil, her purr a constant contented hum in the quiet apartment. He started talking to her again, but the monologues were different. They were less about filling a void and more about sharing his day. I think I'm going to apply to that bookstore job downtown, he'd say, pouring milk into his mug. The one with the grumpy cat in the window. You'd like it. Lots of shelves to hide in. She'd look up at him and blink as if considering the proposition. He started taking pictures of her. Not posed pictures, but stolen moments. Her stretched out in a perfect sun-warmed stripe of light on the rug. Her head poking out from the bookshelf, one ear twitching. Her fascinated, cross-eyed stare as she watched a fly buzz against the window pane. His camera roll, which had been a bleak scroll of screenshots and memes, was now a gallery of her. A record of a life being lived together. The hole in the wall was never mentioned again, but its memory was present in 100 small ways. Leo found himself noticing the small, beautiful things she noticed. A dust mote dancing in a sunbeam. The particular sound of rain against different windows. The way the moon cast a silver path on the floorboards on clear nights. She had taught him how to pay attention, how to find the treasures in the mundane. He'd sometimes catch her sitting by the closet door, not scratching or trying to get in, just sitting quietly, her gaze distant and thoughtful. She was remembering, and he'd go sit on the floor beside her, not touching her, just keeping watch with her over her memories. They'd sit there together until she'd shake her head, as if clearing it, and come over to headbutt his hand, bringing herself fully back into the present, back to him. Weeks bled into a month. Leo got the job at the bookstore. It was part-time, and the pay was terrible, but he liked the smell of old paper and the quiet company of the other bookish, slightly lost souls who worked there. He came home smelling of dust and stories, and Wave would be waiting for him not by the door but on the back of the couch, her favorite new perch from which she could survey her entire kingdom. She'd greet him with a trilling meow, and he'd tell her about his day as he got her dinner ready. The sharp, aching loneliness that had been his constant companion for over a year had receded. It wasn't gone. He knew those kinds of wounds never fully disappear, but it had been gentled. It was a quiet hum in the background now, not a screaming siren in the foreground. He had learned from a tiny, wave-making cat that the antidote to loneliness wasn't necessarily a crowd. It was one true, deep connection. It was being seen in all your brokenness and chosen anyway. One evening, he was curled on the couch reading a novel, his feet tucked under a blanket. Wave was a warm weight on his legs, deeply asleep, her paws twitching as she dreamed of whatever cats dream of, maybe vast, sun-drenched fields, maybe a woman with kind eyes. The room was peaceful, lit by a single lamp, the only sound the soft turn of a page and the whisper of her breathing. He felt her stir. She stretched, her claws extending and retracting against his thigh, and sat up. She gave herself a vigorous shake, then jumped down from the couch with a soft thud. He watched her, expecting her to head to her food bowl or her water dish. But she didn't. She walked with a strange purpose across the living room and into the short hallway that led to the bedroom. She stopped right in front of the closed closet door. Leo's breath caught. He marked his page and set the book down slowly, not wanting to break the spell. He didn't get up. He just watched. She sat there for a long moment, her tail wrapped around her feet, staring at the door. She wasn't trying to get in, she was just looking, remembering, paying her respects. Then she did something he'd never seen her do before. She lowered her head and gently, deliberately butted her forehead against the solid wood of the door. Once, twice. A slow, loving head bump for a memory, a final goodbye. Then she turned. She trotted back into the living room, her mission complete. She leaped back onto the couch, walked up his chest, and without a hint of hesitation, pressed her forehead firmly against his. She held it there for a long, perfect moment, her purr erupting into a loud, joyful rumble that vibrated through his very bones. It was a transfer, a passing of the torch. That was then. This is now. You are my home. She curled up in the hollow of his stomach, tucked her nose under her tail, and fell immediately back to sleep. Leo sat there in the lamplight, his hand resting on her softly rising and falling side, tears welling in his eyes for the second time since he'd known her. But these weren't tears of shared grief or overwhelming pain. They were tears of a quiet, profound joy. This was the final gift. Not an object pulled from the dark, but a gesture of pure, unadulterated presence. She had closed the door on her, past, not by forgetting it, but by fully embracing her present, by choosing him completely. Finally, he understood now. Love isn't about erasing the past or curing the loneliness. It's about finding someone who sees the hole in your wall, the shrine you keep in the dark, and doesn't try to seal it up or tear it down. They just sit with you in front of it. They keep watch with you, and then when you're ready, they help you turn around and face the light again. They become the new place you call home. The tiny kitten who had waved down cars on a highway hadn't just been signaling for someone to stop. She'd been signaling for someone to see her, to choose her, to help her carry the weight of her love. And in doing so, she had taught a broken man how to do the very same thing. It was the oldest story in the world, and the newest. A story of trust, of second chances, and of the quiet world-altering power of a single desperate wave being seen and answered. You stayed till the end. Thank you. If it felt like a soft hug or a warm purr in your heart, subscribing lets me bring you more moments like this.